If I say the word beer, what do you think of? If you'd asked me that same question any time up to just 2 years ago, I would have said it's a man thing and it tastes really bitter. Then I opened an ancestral door that completely changed my views and experience of beer. I didn't know, for example, that women have been the predominant brewers of beer throughout history up to just 400 years ago. Neither did I know that up till that same time period, beer tasted completely different to the beer that we are used to now. Join us in this episode to hear the real story of beer, how we messed it up, and why I'm so passionate about bringing beer back to where it belongs, the kitchen. Welcome to the Ancestral Kitchen Podcast with Alison, a European town dweller in central Italy, and Andrea, living on a newly created family farm in northwest Washington State, USA. Pull up a chair at the table and join us as we talk about eating, cooking, and living with ancient ancestral food wisdom in a modern world kitchen.
Good morning, Alison.
Hey, good afternoon. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. I'm so excited for this episode. This has been one that you've been teasing me with for a long time, so I'm really ready for this.
You're right. Yeah.
So let's say thank you to our patrons who are bringing this podcast to you. We have two new patrons, Marianne, who is in Norway, and Sarah. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, but it is she is in Canada. It's in Canada. Yep. Wow. I'm really good at grammar.
Yeah.
So she's in Canada, and that's cool, Alison. Two people in two completely different countries.
Yeah.
Probably never would have
I'm excited
ran into each other in real life.
Someone in Norway.
Yeah.
And seeing Marianne on the Discord channel, sort of chatting about, what her seasons are like and the grain she's got in Norway.
Didn't she say she has the black oats that you talked about?
Yeah.
That's amazing. Like, who knew?
No.
They must be really hardy.
Yeah, I think they are. That's the joy of oats.
Is Sarah in the Discord yet? Do you know?
Not
I didn't
yet.
see her in there. Okay.
No, I haven't seen her yet. No.
Hopefully she can pop up in there. The Discord is really fun. It's just a, chat place where we can all get together and visit and share recipes and talk about things like roasting a goose.
Yeah.
Nick, looking at you. And speaking of the patrons, Alison, as of this recording, you and I had a couple weeks ago, we just had another KTC live, which is really fun.
Every live, yeah.
Yep. I should probably say what KTC means. So every third Saturday of the month, Alison and I hop on a Zoom, and any patrons that wish to also jump on and join us, and we talk about food, and we record it, and it goes up on the private podcast feed. So if you're a patron who lives, on the bottom of the world or something, in the time zone just doesn't work for you, then you can listen to it after. Yeah. But literally everybody does sit at their kitchen tables. So really
exactly.
are.
It is a kitchen table chat. Yeah. We're all just sitting around chatting. It was so lovely to see so many people last time. And I'm hoping that the one that we do on Saturday will be a really good chat too.
Yeah. It's really fun. I mean, I feel like well, you know how it is when you and I just talk, Alison, stuff comes up in conversation that you might not necessarily have thought of putting down as a question, but just the conversation brings it up. And we all came away learning something with something new. So
I'm feeling really inspired.
Yep. And Alison, do you have, speaking of inspired and the people who inspire us, you have 2 reviews to read.
Yeah, what a good segue that was. You're a pro.
Why, thank you.
So, we have had some lovely reviews on Apple Podcasts, and I've got 2 to read out. The first one is by G. Beners. That's what the little tag is on Apple, and it says, "Great show. I recently stumbled upon the Ancestral Kitchen podcast, and I absolutely love it. I've learned so much by listening, and I've gotten so many new ideas for the kitchen. I've also taken to putting schmaltz on my bread. So delicious. and I'm looking forward to trying more of the talked about dishes. I mostly listen on my long drive in and home from a very stressful job, and the discussions help me to relax, be in a better mental place, and plan future meals. Thank you both for sharing. Well, thank you, G. Berners, if that's how you say your name. Thank you ever so much
Well,
for the lovely review.
If you have a stressful job, this is the episode for you.
Yeah, you're right. That was a
No,
5-star.
that's
We got another
awesome.
5-star review from Dana Bailey, who says, "Well done.
Nice.
Very rarely do I anticipate a new episode from a podcast. I can usually take or leave most shows, but this pod has been lovingly binge listened, and I cannot wait to hear
Oh
what
my
you
gosh.
two do next." Isn't that lovely? Thank you so much for a
I love
wonderful
it.
podcast.
Thank you.
Isn't that nice?
Really
beautiful.
That's an
Thank
amazing
you
review.
for
Thank
leaving
you
reviews.
both.
If you're on Apple, you can do that. On Spotify, you can star us, but on Apple, you can write some lovely words like that, and we love reading them. Thank you.
I wonder
Have you eaten, Andrea?
if I
sorry.
If I had iTunes, could I review our own podcast? I don't have iTunes. I guess I can't write a fake
I don't know.
review.
Is that cheating?
I
don't have iTunes
amazing. Okay, I didn't eat a real meal, but I cut some of the raw cheddar. I sliced some raw cheddar that I got from Azure Standard, and I made. Remember, I told you I made the coffee with that mushroom mix in it.
Yeah.
So I made that with the hot chocolate one that they have. So they have one that's hot chocolate. It has like cocoa powder, maple sugar, and a bunch of mushrooms. I don't know what
sounds nice. So it's like a sort of a mochaccino kind of thing with coffee and chocolate.
Yeah. Sure. That name sounds good and prestigious. And then I mixed in a fair amount of raw cream. So I really feel like if I have, a quarter cup of raw cream in the morning, I can go for a pretty long time on that fuel.
I think that sounds really mentally kind of satiating as well, because, you've got that cheese, you've got the cream, you've got cocoa powder, and you've got coffee. Having those in a sort of quick hit in the morning, you feel like, wow.
It checks a lot of boxes.
I've really had something luxurious and nice.
Yeah.
Sounds yummy.
And raw cream that you separate yourself is probably for somebody who's like gagging right now. I should say it's more closer to half and half than like a heavy whipping cream.
Sounds lovely.
It is lovely. And did you have lunch?
Yeah, we did. I made a cast iron ground meat, as you would say ground meat. I would say mince, with lots of things in. I had pork mince and cabbage and leeks and Savoy cabbage as well, and some chard, caraway seeds, cumin seeds. I ran out of coriander seeds, got to get them, and some garlic and some stock, some pork stock. Bit of everything, really. That recipe is in the forthcoming cookbook because it's so versatile. I make it differently each time, and it's a staple. Had that with some sourdough spelt bread with lard and salt and some sauerkraut on the top of the ground meat. Really delicious.
I saw that
I should have
recipe
said
in the book and the picture. Yum.
Yeah, it's tasty. It's easy and tasty. And there's leftovers for Gable to take to school tomorrow, which makes a difference to me. It means I don't have to prep or anything else. And what I was going to say is I should have said for this episode that I had beer with it. Unfortunately, I'm not that organised and I didn't. That would have been perfect, wouldn't it?
Well, let's just end now. We're done.
Yeah, exactly. So today we are talking about beer. And really, what have we done to beer and what can we do about beer? And this is kind of a culmination of 2 years of playing around over here in my kitchen. And the first thing I really wanted to ask, Andrea, was to ask you what you think about beer, what your kind of preconceptions and what beer means to you.
Oh, well, I didn't grow up with beer in the house since my parents chose not to drink alcohol. And so as a kid, I always thought it was like bad, evil. Even though nobody really said that, I just, assumed. And as an adult, then when I finally tried beer, I was like, oh, wow, I wasn't missing anything.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
I've kind of always thought it's something guys drink when they're watching football, and it's gross and it comes in cans and they
Yeah.
put pictures of it
Okay.
on the
So
side of trucks.
even though, I mean, my parents did drink, and my dad drinks English bitter and Guinness and that kind of thing. And I grew
Okay.
up with, him having that every now and again when he used to go out and play cricket. I still got the
Right.
same view as you, in that
Right.
predominantly for me, until about 2 years ago, beer was a man's thing. It was drunk by men. It was made by men. It was, my ex-husband used to drink it, every night down the pub. And
Oh, okay.
I just
Uh-huh.
didn't like the taste of it. I'd sometimes I'd try some of his, or I'd try some other beers, and it just tastes horrible, bitter, horrible. Didn't like them, and because of that, when I did used to drink, when I was younger, I was always a wine person, not a beer person. So we kind of
Oh,
got
okay.
similar views on it, and I think there's a lot of people who think that they don't like the taste of beer,
Yeah.
and men drink beer, and
I
like I
should.
said, until go on.
Oh, no, sorry.
I was
I,
just going to say, until 2 years ago, I thought that, that's what
oh,
beer's
okay.
been for me all my
Yes.
life. What
Yeah.
were you going to say?
I was just going to say that I should add that my two exposures to ancestral beer were when I was
Mm,
very small. I remember my mom reading a book called Stories of the Pilgrims, and they described how much beer they took on the Mayflower and how much each
mm-hmm,
adult and child drank. And I thought as a
mm.
kid, what? And gross. Everybody's drunk all the time. And then I also learned when I was in my heavy ancient Egypt phase
Uh-huh.
that they would brew a thick beer with bread. And then
Yeah,
I was very fascinated by these um, artifacts of straws with
yeah.
holes in it that they would drink it through. And we, us kids, as we called ourselves, us kids
Mm.
would say, how disgusting is that? So
Yeah,
those are my
yeah,
two
yeah.
ancestral exposures.
I think that beer now, basically, to kick off the episode, is industrial. Although there are growing craft brewers around who do it on a smaller scale, really, beer is industrially made. It's not homemade. It's the same consistently. People want the same flavours, or people have been educated to want the same flavours. And so every beer of a certain make has to taste exactly the same, whether you buy it, in America or England, whether you buy it 2 years apart. It always has to be the same. Beer is bitter, and beer is drunk by men, and beer is brewed by men. There really aren't many women involved in brewing. There's a small resurgence of women brewing in the last kind of 10 years, but really that's what beer is now. But beer has not been like that for most of history. Literally, that's how beer has been for the last 150, 200 years. Beer has been
Wow.
drunk for 7,000 years. In fact, some of the research that I've done said some people posit that it was beer, not bread, that caused us to settle down and want to have agriculture and
Yeah,
grow
I could see
grains.
that. I could see that.
Yeah. And until industrialization, women were the primary brewers of beer around the world. When you start to dive into this, you realize how widespread it was that women were brewers. So you start with perhaps the most famous example of it. Ninkasi is the ancient Sumerian goddess of beer, and there's a piece of poetry called the Hymn to Ninkasi, which is dated about 1500 before Christian era. And then you go into the myths of so many different types of populations and cultures: the Vikings, the Slavic, the Egyptians, Chinese, Japanese, African, South American. If you read Wild Fermentation, you know that women used to chew, or still do chew, corn to help release its starches before it's brewed up in chicha in South America. And really to go through archaeological pictures, to go through poetry, to go through myth. You find all over the globe that women were the brewers. In Europe, women were the brewers until the monasteries took over on continental Europe. So, in kind of Germany, France, the continental part of Europe in the 11th century. And that was to do with the church wanting to own brewing. In England, the country where I come from, women brewed in their kitchens. So they took the grain and they malted it. They dried that malt over the fire. They made liquid with it, sugary liquid to ferment. They fermented that liquid with a local yeast culture. And they gave that resulting brew to their families to drink. Just like you saw on that ship, the Mayflower, children drank beer, women drank beer, men drank beer, everyone drank beer. And if there was beer left over, the women would give it to the neighbours, sell it to the neighbours. Some women had small businesses in their towns selling beer locally. And they used to do it every week, just like a bread making routine might be, because beer, or as it was back then, ale, which we'll talk about a bit later, didn't keep. The thing in beer now that allows it to keep is the addition of hops. That changed the whole kind of history of ale and beer. And because hops weren't in the brewed drink then, beer was made literally weekly because it would go off. And in England and throughout the world, it was women's work, either because it was a household task, just like making bread was. And so in England, the women made the bread, the women brewed the beer. Or in other cultures, and earlier cultures, because beer was really closely linked to rituals. It was used ceremonially, and women had a really important role to play in preparing for the rituals. So it is completely different to how we view beer now. We view beer as a man's thing.
Totally.
But historically, until 200 years ago, beer was a woman's thing, not a man's thing.
Well, I think we actually view beer as a recreational thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wasn't in the past. It was ceremonial, or it was actually needed and drunk every single day as part of kind of life, as part of hydration.
Yeah. And that was part of not getting dysentery, right?
Yeah.
Just to bring that up. So funny. Are you going to mention that book now, or were you going to mention it at the end? I
can mention it now.
Okay, because I was going to say something about that book.
Yeah. Okay, so that book is a fabulous book that I spent a lot of time poring over the last year, which is a book called Ale, Beer and Brewsters in England by an academic called Judith Bennett. And that's where I've learned so much about brewsters. And brewsters is a term for women who brew. So when I brew my beer, I'm a brewster. And I think it comes from England originally, the term brewster. So it's a book all about how women were the brewers in England, how they brewed, the evidence to show that, and then how that changed when industrialization came along.
William and Mary Brewster were two of the Pilgrim parents on the ship. And they brought with them their sons Love and Wrestling, and then they had 3 other children that they left in back in Holland that came later, Jonathan, and then their daughters Patience and Fear.
Wow.
I love Puritan names.
Yeah.
I just want to name a kid
They
Wrestling.
must have been Brewsters. They must have been Brewsters.
Yeah,
I guess,
or descended of Brewsters, one or the other.
Yeah.
And you had told me, so this is a funny thing that doesn't really have anything to do with food, kind of. But if listeners want to hear my voice somewhere else, then do you remember I told you, Alison, you told me about that book and I got it.
Mm. Mm.
And around the same time, a friend asked me if I would do some voice acting for
Mhm.
a podcast he was making. And the character he wanted me to play was a female Brewster in um it's like in a fantasy world that he created, but it's like medieval based, kind of like Lord of the Rings type thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And it's
So you've been
so
channeling the Brewsters.
yeah, and it's such a cool, like, I don't know how much I can say about the project since I don't think it will be out by the time this podcast goes out, but
Uh,
if people will follow, you could go to the website or the Instagram. It's called Can't Quit Comics. This is the company
mhm.
that he made so that, he wouldn't have to be told what to say. He was like, I want to say what I want to say and draw what I want to draw.
Mm,
And
get that.
he creates amazing artwork, and he's got this team of amazing people, and they're putting together this incredible music and all these incredible voice actors on this. I mean, it is so mind-blowing. It is so mind-blowing. So if people follow that, then when that comes out, they'll be able to hear some really fun quality content that's
Yeah, it sounds like fun to
pretty
record
clean.
as well.
Yeah, it's just a really fun project, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of it and to see it unfold, because I've never been behind the scenes on anything like this, and
Mm. We should
it's
put that in the show notes so people
we
can go find
should,
it.
yeah,
Just
we'll
click
put it in the show
the
notes so people
story.
can see it.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice.
When I first heard Alison talking about boza, the fermented drink made of millet that's a household name in Turkey, I felt as if I was being transported back to a bazaar in the Ottoman Empire or traveling the Silk Road on the back of a camel, and I knew I wanted to taste it. Boza is fizzy, sweet, tart, and it's full of probiotics. You can drop it into your smoothies, spoon it on top of your breakfast, or drink it in the traditional way they still do in Istanbul, topped with cinnamon and toasted chickpeas. Fermented millet drinks were first made in that region of Europe in the 8th century BC, and as with all of Alison's courses, she's gone above and beyond in research and experimentation and testing on Rob and Gabe, and given us an easy way to recreate the goodness in our own homes. If you'd like a fun and tasty way to get more probiotics into your life, bring her into your kitchen and have her walk you through how to bring this ancestral dairy-free, gluten-free fermentation recipe with her amazing Boza video course. Head to www.ancestralkitchen.com/Boza, BOZA, to check out the video course. And happy fermentation.
So
Who knew that
you
was
would have
going to happen?
you would have been in that kind of environment before industrialization, where
Right.
women did the brewing. And then when industrialization came along, women were slowly pushed out of the brewing world. And
Like with
brewing
so
was
many
taken
things.
out of the kitchen, like so many other things, out of the community, and taken to a place where it could make a profit. So, as with so many other things in industrialization, that really started a chain of events which has led to the beer that we know these days. And I wanted to explain kind of how that happened.
Okay.
So first of all, we go back to Pasteur, who I know we talked about recently on the raw milk episode.
Him again.
That wonderful man, yes. His discovery in the 1850s led to commercial beer yeast being developed in the 1880s.
Wait, we should jump on this for just 1 second. Isn't it because of wine that he wasn't researching for the safety of milk or anything like that? It was because of wine and preserving wine. Wasn't he commissioned by like Napoleon or something?
That's correct. And then he was able to isolate exactly what was happening during a degradation process, the fermentation process. You put a nice spin on it, degradation, fermentation. And so then really his discovery was only meant for one thing, but it was then applied to a lot of other things and changed a lot of other things. And brewers actually took his science and then developed in a lab a beer yeast. So that was the kind of first thing that moved beer on. And then the second thing was hops. As I alluded to earlier, hops weren't originally used routinely in beer, but they were introduced into England, the place that I know the most about, in the 1500s from the Flemish market, so kind of Holland and Germany, who were already using hops. And the important thing about hops is that they're antibacterial. So in a fermentation that is alcoholic, the thing that produces the alcohol generally is the yeasts, and those are the things you want to encourage.
Right.
Bacteria, that if they are in your fermentation, they can produce other flavours. And those flavours, those bacteria, if they are allowed to proliferate in your beer, can sour it or make it go sour much quicker. So before hops, as I said, beer didn't keep. You had to drink it in a few days. Putting hops into beer meant that beer would keep. And that was absolutely instrumental, because it meant that beer could be made on a much, much bigger scale. You could make it, you could bottle it, you could sell it, you could transport it.
Of course.
And then it wasn't part of a daily, weekly routine in a local area only anymore. Its possibilities became much wider.
And
so
wouldn't you lose benefits by, you and I know that multiple ferments, kefir and things, or kombucha, you have some yeast and you have some bacterias, and you don't want to lose either of those, really.
That's an interesting point, because the loss of diversity in having a single yeast culture, which is what was developed off the back of Pasteur's discovery, means that the beers that are being produced today do not have that diversity at all. And also having hops in them means that they don't necessarily have a bacterial input. Some craft brewers do add bacteria under kind of very sterile guided conditions in order to bring out certain flavours. But the diversity was lost. And importantly, for what happened with industrialisation, the need to make it fresh and regularly was lost. And that meant what happened was it went commercial. It turned from a product that was made in people's kitchens to a product that was made in factories. And in the UK, which is the area that I know most about, the change from homemade kitchen ale that only lasted a few days to industrial beer made in factories, it was pushed by Pasteur's discovery and pushed by hops, but then there were lots of other kind of social and economic factors that meant that resulted in women being pushed out. So, for example, in order to make beer on a big scale, you need a lot more equipment than you do if you're just making it in your kitchen with a kettle and some containers. And of course, if you're going to set up an enterprise, you've got to buy that equipment. You've got to have a bigger space. You've got to buy all this extra equipment. And in medieval England, women couldn't get loans. They weren't, they were women, not men. Men could go and borrow money to buy equipment and to buy space, and women couldn't. So women couldn't move to producing on a larger scale. In addition, at the same time as industrialisation kind of blossomed, guilds were set up. So, there was the guild of this, the guild of brewing, the guild of butchery, the guild of other things. And women couldn't take part in those guilds. So all the networking that was happening, all the kind of loans and different things that were happening as part of those guilds, all the protection that was afforded to the people who were part of guilds by the local governments, women just didn't get a look in. And then that just mushroomed. And it just meant that the woman who was brewing beer in her kitchen every week just faded slowly over like 100, 150 years. And the whole thing was taken into factories and commercially processed and shipped around and run by men. Which is, in my view, a shame. A shame. And it's something that fascinates me and
Yeah.
has fascinated me
Yeah.
for the last 2 years, really.
In my very brief reading of beer in America, um,
Mm.
I just looked to see what, the colonials did. And the article I read, which I can link here, it's not a scholarly
Yeah.
article or anything, but they said that when people emigrated here, they had a hard time making beer that tasted like what they were used to because of the wild yeast.
Okay.
And they imported hop seeds from
Oh,
England and brought
that's
them here.
interesting.
It wasn't something that grew here. Now it grows like everywhere here. Our neighbors have hops that grow up on a vine thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Wow.
there was this little ditty from the 1630s that made me think of
Mm.
you.
Mm.
I'll read it. It says, "If barley be wanting to make it to malt, we must be content and think it no fault. For we can make liquor to sweeten our lips of pumpkins and parsnips and walnut tree chips."
Mm.
I just thought it was funny.
That's nice. It shows the kind of different things that we used to
Yeah.
brew.
Yeah.
I mean, though we have a tradition of using grains to brew, but obviously beers were brewed with tree saps, they were brewed with squash, they were brewed with anything that had sweetness in it, and that wherever you found yourself, that South American chicha brew is made with corn because corn is what
Mm.
grows there and it has
Yeah.
starch in it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's interesting as well because if those people came over, for example, on the Mayflower and they were coming from Holland, then Holland had hops a lot sooner, a lot longer before England
Oh,
did. And so
that's a
probably
good
they were
point.
used to having beer with hops.
And getting
So
the
when they
taste.
came to the States, if there were no hops there, then they would have had a very different tasting beer,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
which
And if
we
they
can
had,
actually talk about because
if
it tastes
they,
completely different.
yeah, totally. If they had a hoppy beer also, I don't know if they did when they were on the Mayflower, but then it would have
Mm,
lasted for the whole trip.
yeah, yeah,
But I don't
completely. I
know.
don't know how long did it take for the Mayflower to get across?
Too long.
Yeah, they couldn't have had ale then because it wouldn't have lasted. Literally, it lasts like 4
No.
days. That's it.
Yeah, it was not 4 days.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about the difference between the brewing that we have now and the brewing that ancient or medieval ales used, because a lot of people home brew now, and the word home, they're doing it in their kitchen. They're not commercial
Right.
brewers, but
Right.
their processes are very, very different to how beers would have been brewed before industrialization. And I wanted to kind of explain the two differences so you can see clearly what's changed. So if we look at modern home brewing, that uses chemically sanitized vessels that are closed to air, literally. So they're designed to keep out unwanted, in quotes, bacteria.
Okay.
Homebrewing uses industrially made dried malt, which you can, buy from brewing supplies, or some people use a jar of syrup, like, looks like a jar of molasses, barley malt
Wow.
syrup, which has been made by someone who's malted barley, and then that's been made into a syrup, and people use that as their sugary kind of source rather than using the actual malt. Then a liquid, which is called
Wait.
wort. Yeah, no, you want me to
Rather
stop?
than, sorry, you know more than I know. So,
Yeah.
they use the syrup instead of using what?
Grain.
Okay, so
So
instead of using a grain to produce the malt.
yeah, so no, you have to, in order to brew, you have to have a sugary liquid, which is called wort.
Okay.
And you can make that, and it's traditionally made by mixing malted grains in hot water. And that draws out their sugars and that leaves them in the liquid, and then you ferment that sugary liquid. But a lot of home brewers don't mix actual malted grains with water. They have a jar of syrup,
Right.
which is an
Okay.
extract of those malted grains made in a factory, and they mix that with water and then
And
ferment that.
can you define a malted grain for me?
Yeah, okay. So a malted grain is a grain that has germinated and then you can
Okay.
see its tail. I mean, we'd call it sprouted, I guess, in the ancestral food community.
Uh-huh.
And then during that process, the starches are converted and certain enzymatic reactions happen.
Mhm.
And then when it has germinated to the correct amount, when the tail is a certain length, that germination is stopped by drying. And then that grain is kind of held in suspension in that kind of germinated form. Its sugar's in a different state to what it was when it was just a solid, oat grain or barley grain. And then that malt is used in the beer.
So that
Does
is
that
a
make sense?
malted. So sprouted is malted. Am I
Yeah,
understanding?
malted, yeah. Sprouted is malted. Yeah,
Wow.
basically.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
So when you make
Yeah.
that buckwheat stuff that we talked about in the, 3 nourishing
Mm,
traditions recipes I love
mm.
episode, you're
Yeah.
basically malting the buckwheat?
Yeah. The science of malting is very, very complicated, as
Yeah,
many
don't do
patronising
that for
many
me.
patronising brewers have told me when I told them I make my own malt. They say, "Oh, malting's a science. You've got to do a degree in it." And I'm like, "No, I'm just doing it in a
Do you though?
little jar in my kitchen."
You know,
Actually,
Alison, that is the same thing that homeschool moms run into when you say, "Oh, I just love reading Googe," and they say, "Oh, she's one of the minor Victorian." You need a good education in literary science, literary to be able to to read Googe,
yeah,
and you're like, "Oh, I don't know. I
yeah.
have a high school degree and I diploma. Wow,
So that
I'm really smart. I have a high school diploma, and I enjoy reading Googe and
exactly.
Boswell and
Enjoy. That's the word, isn't
yeah."
it? Enjoy. So I think there is a difference probably that you would not want a malted grain you're using beer to have grown any green on it. That's too far. You've got to try to understand how far you can malt a grain, how far you want that sprout to come out before you go, right, I'm going to stop it now. And I'm still learning that.
And I probably don't even need to ask this, but I assume that syrup may or may not have questionable ingredients in it. Like it's not something you and I would say, in a pinch, I'd use this. Probably.
I certainly wouldn't use it. I don't
Yeah.
know. I haven't seen a jar, so I don't know what ingredients. I think actually it's just barley malt syrup. I don't think it has extra things in. I think,
Who knows?
but I haven't used it, so I don't know.
trust it.
No. So that's the liquid that you ferment, and then home brewers nowadays buy a packet of yeast that's been cultured in a laboratory, and they will usually wake that yeast up by putting it in something, and then they will pitch. The word pitch is when you actually add the yeast to your brew. They will pitch that laboratory strain of yeast into their beer. And that yeast is usually a single culture. There are a myriad different types that have been developed in labs for particular styles of beer and lager. So that's the yeast that's used. And then hops are also added to modern home brewing in various different ways. You can dry hop, you can wet hop, you can do all these different things with hops. But hops are added to sanitize the brew, to keep the bacteria population down, and also to bitter the brew, because that's what we are used to now. We're used to beer
Really?
tasting bitter. So people add hops.
Did you know we have a Patreon for the listeners of the Ancestral Kitchen Podcast? That's right, can't get enough of this? Well, there's more of it over on the Patreon feed, just waiting for you. We have a variety of levels to choose from and a bunch of different benefits to enjoy. Your sponsorship keeps the podcast on the air ad-free and helps us keep buying books to read and talk about on the podcast. And also helps Alison buy bizarre ingredients at the farmer's market so she can ferment them and tell us about them later. Check us out at patreon.com/Ancestral Kitchen Podcast.
Wow. And that's the thing I don't like
That's
about
modern home
it.
brewing. Yeah, that's modern home brewing. So
Okay.
let me take you back now 5,000 years to a beer called Boozer, Bouza, which people who listen to the podcast regularly have heard me talking about before.
Yeah, I never heard of it
Boozer
until you, ever.
Is
Never.
a 5,000-year-old Egyptian ale, which I originally learnt about in Sandor Katz's Wild Fermentation book and have been playing with ever since. There are other brews about the same time period in different areas that really cover a similar method. So Boozer is different because Boozer uses clean but unsanitized vessels to ferment, and those vessels are open to the air during the fermentation process, not closed with an airlock. The Boozer process uses whole grains that are malted and processed at home. And then all of those grains go into the fermentation. So rather than making a sugary liquid and losing the grains at an early stage, in Boozer, all of the grains go into the fermentation and they stay in that fermentation till it's complete. In addition to malted grains, you also put in grains that have been soaked and made into a par-baked bread. They are also put into the brew. So not all the grains are malted. And then a sourdough starter is used to ferment the brew, to kickstart the fermentation. So that's the process that I learned from well fermentation, and kind of that's where I started my home brewing ancient ale journey. And, you know, when I talk about those two different methods, and we've talked about them, you know, both of them use grains and both of them fermented. But apart from that, they are completely different. You know, one's open to the air, one's not. One uses a yeast cultured in the laboratory. The other one uses a yeast that's at home. One uses the grains actually in the ferment. The other one doesn't. One uses hops. The other one doesn't. Completely different. In those 5,000 years between the ancient Egyptians making ale, I should say, not beer, and our modern concept of beer, everything in the processing has completely changed. And I feel that that's not a positive change. And I'm excited about discovering these ancient techniques and kind of bouncing off them and learning. And because I want to bring brewing back to where it came from, which is the home. That feels really important to me. That's kind of part of my mission.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good mission.
I feel like, you know, people that I've encountered on this journey were saying to me, well, why do you want to do this? What's wrong? And I feel like it ties so well into what we talk about all the time in the podcast, which is basically everything that we've taken out of the home, we've gone some way to ruining. Industrialization has meant an increase in efficiency in many things, and in food, an increase in portability. But that process has made our health much worse, and it's made our food taste worse, in my opinion.
Yes.
And I think it's also generally the trajectory we are on. It's ruining our daily lives. I don't feel like, you know, I particularly want to go back to medieval England. I think living in medieval England was incredibly hard. But I also think that there's a balance to be found here. And the way that we are living at the moment, sitting in front of computers 12 hours a day, driving around in metal boxes, the food that we're eating, the way that we're treating our environment, the way that we're educating our children, the way that we're eating bread that's been whipped up in a factory and sold to us in plastic. I feel like we are way off it. We've gone way too far.
Yeah.
And the more we can decentralize, the better. And, you know, part of that is doing it yourself. Part of it is taking your custom away from big entities, which we've talked about. You know, we've had 2 episodes on quitting supermarkets. And really there is a lot we can do to mitigate what industrialization has done and is doing to our personal lives and our relationships and our communities and the world.
Absolutely.
So I just I'll get off my soapbox. Wait till I start talking about yeast, and then I'll get back on my soapbox.
It's a good soapbox. Well, I want to
So,
ask you one or two questions
yeah,
before
go
you
on.
move to the next section,
Please
if I
do.
can.
Yeah.
One
please do.
is when you talk about anytime you talk about taking things out of the home and moving them to a factory, there's another thing that besides the actual product itself, there's something that is lost and something that is unfortunately gained. And the thing that is lost is usually from anything you produce in the home, there's a bunch of beneficial byproducts. Because when you really look at ancestral food, because food was scarce for all of human history up to basically the last 200 years, then you didn't waste any of it. So you found alternate uses. And I wanted to ask you if there were any byproducts of beer. And the other thing is that you negatively gain when you move something to a factory, you produce a byproduct there that is typically a waste product and often can have detrimental effects to our environment or even our health, in instances of like in the 1930s where all this industrial leftover malted barley and things was being fed to cows. And if you listen to the raw milk episode, then you heard a little bit about that and the bad effects that that had on cows and things like that. So could you say if there's any byproducts of beer that can be used in home?
Yeah. So ever since I've started making beer 2 years ago, I use all my spent grain to make bread. So I haven't thrown away anything.
So you're proving that theory that you
making.
addressed in the beginning, Alison. You're probably right. They're probably right. It was beer first and then bread.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that, but
No, the
I
chicken
feel
or the
like,
egg kind of a thing.
when you read Stephen Harabuna's Sacred Herbal and Healing Beers, you realize how fundamental alcoholic drinks were to communal ties and celebrations and rituals, and how that moving of your state of mind was magical, was seen as incredible. And beer wasn't around all the time. Alcoholic drinks weren't just there. You had to actually make them. You had to do something to create them. And no one knew what yeast was. So it seemed like it was a magical process. And, beer had a very, very different place in those societies than it has now. And that Stephen Harabuna book explains that really well. I can't remember what I was saying before that. I got all excited about
No, I'll put you back. I'll put you back on track.
Thank you.
But is it this is something that always strikes me when I read about the medievals and things like medieval cosmology and the sorts of legends and tales and things that were being produced at that time. Even though we understand what yeast is now, is it any less magical? Like, is it really? I don't think so.
I don't feel like it is. I don't feel like
you
it
were
is.
going to tell us about yeast, and then
Yeah. Oh, I will.
Yeah.
When you read the kind of myths and the poems that come from these societies that went before us, you realize how amazing what yeast was to them. How they talk about what could be doing, how they have rituals that things have to be stirred in certain ways, that certain people weren't allowed at certain times, or a woman had to do it, or this had to happen.
Right.
You weren't allowed to do it when you were stressed. All these just really life warming things that were part of a ritual that was those communities.
Well, comforting and stable. I mean, when you're in a world as unstable as, when, the Anglo-Saxon Jutes can come over the hill and kill you all suddenly, then having some stability, and the rule is you don't touch it when you're this, like, that actually does provide some comfort. Like, I think often of people in refugee camps and how traumatic that is, and the mothers that will enact the bedtime rituals to try to keep some sort of rule of stability. Like, those things are really important. And I think when we look back, as you and I spend a lot of time doing, when we look back, and like you said, when you look at the different beliefs and legends, although they didn't use words like, microbiological or things like that, They used different vernacular, but the description is just as accurate,
Yeah.
which is kind of mind blowing. In ranging from like astronomy to, um, I don't know, just all kinds of things. So
Exactly. It's a thread that runs through every
Mhm.
part of the community, an attitude, a kind of a wonder. It's a really beautiful thing, I think. So let me talk about yeast. So most
Yes.
people who recreate medieval ales, we were just talking about this before we started recording, do it with commercial yeast and airlocks. So I remember getting quite excited learning about a book by Patrick McGovern, who's an archaeologist who's been and, actually discovered shards of pottery with yeasts on them and malted bits of barley. And he's
Gosh,
worked with
amazing.
breweries in America to recreate ancient beers. And there's a book on it, and I started reading it. And then I realised really very soon that he was using yeast from a lab that had been developed in a lab, and he was using an airlock to make his beer because he's making a beer for a brewery that
Huh.
wants to sell its beer, and people expect a certain
Right.
taste. And so they want to generate something that's palatable to the majority of
Right.
people. I've got another interesting kind of anecdote around wild yeast as well. But let me first of all say why wild yeast is important. So for me, I want to recreate ale as it would have been made in the home. And a huge part of that is wild yeast. People who were making beers from 7,000 years ago up to 200 years ago were not using yeasts that had been cultured in a lab. And it feels very important to me to work on creating a wild yeast population for my beer, even though it makes it much harder. And I feel that there are two issues really with yeast and wild yeast. Number one is diversity. Diversity is such a word that we know is so positive. And having diverse cultures is positive. Having diversity in our soil, in our environment, having biodiversity, all that equals strength, resilience in our environment. And, sometimes it's good to have uniformity and efficiency, but not for everything, and not here. We don't need to. The second issue is democratic. And that's something I feel really strongly about. And I feel it around sourdough as well. These yeasts, these bacteria are in our air. They're on our grain. And someone has taken that and is making a profit from it. I feel like, sometimes, again, when we're living together in communities, it's good to give someone management of something. If you live in a city and you want to have power in your house, well, you're not going to go and try and get that power yourself. And, unless you've got solar panels, it's difficult. In that situation, in the situation our society finds itself in big cities, then probably it's a good thing to have someone providing you with power. But we don't need to do that for yeast. This stuff is all around us. And
Right.
when you look at brewers that are recreating medieval ales, they are using packet yeast. And even, there's brewers who say, well, I'm going to create a beer from a local yeast. And so they'll get, for example, some plums or something, and they'll take the yeast off the skin of the plums, and then they'll send it to a lab, and they will isolate the
Really?
single yeast culture, that
Wow.
has been on that plum, and they will recreate it and, create it in a lab, and then they will dry it and packet it, and they use that single yeast culture to make their beer. Really,
Wow.
there is no one that I
Had no
know
idea.
of. If someone knows of someone, tell me. But there is no one who's using wild yeast like that and also not using hops. Because, people, I can understand on a commercial level, you're brewing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gallons all at a time, and you've got to sell it. And you've got to sell it to a market that has a particular taste for beer. And therefore, you want it to taste a certain way, and you want it to taste a certain way on the bottle you're making this week, and the bottle you're making next month, and the bottle you're making the month after. And so I can understand the pressures on commercial breweries, but, I'm doing this in my kitchen. And so one of the big things about bringing beer home is using a wild yeast. The second one for me is using minimal equipment, because we should be able to make beer with what we have in our kitchens. My ancestors in England did that. They had big kettles, they had big saucepans. They used the equipment that they used for cooking, things that would go on a normal stove.
Right.
So it's important to me that I'm not buying extra equipment to make beer, because I don't need to. And then the last one is no hops. And that one is really because I'm making something for my home, and I don't mind that it only lasts 3 or 4 days. I'm not going to sell it to anyone. So why would I use hops? In addition, I don't really like the taste of hops. That's where we started this episode. I don't like their bitter flavour. And I know that hops make you sleepy. They're soporific. And they also got estrogenic properties in them. And, if I'm going to bring something like that into my life, I want to do it very consciously for a particular reason, not just because I want it to be in my beer.
Is that where the
And so,
is that where the beer belly comes from? Is that estrogen?
well, yeah.
Property.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of the reason why, beer bellies are associated with men who drink a lot of beer. So ale, go on.
Well,
Ask on.
I was going to say something about hops, so I wanted to say it before you moved to the next thing.
Yeah, do.
I looked right after you mentioned it, and Holland, in the Netherlands, they started using hops in the 1390s.
Yeah.
And the Pilgrims arrived there in 1607, obviously. So they had already been using it for quite some time there.
For
The
many
trip
centuries.
took 66 days. So I think we can safely assume that they brought a hoppy beer.
Yeah, completely.
Probably.
So, that's just part of the grain bill of ales, of beers around now. But ale used to be grain, water, yeast. The grain was malted at home.
Right.
The water was the water around, and the yeast was the yeast that had been cultured and shared around communities, maybe shared with the bread makers, maybe not, but certainly shared within community. And that's the ale that I want to make. I forgot to tell you something, another little anecdote around yeast, which I'm going to go back to, which is that at one point during our journey, the last 2 years, I wanted to use a commercial yeast to see if a problem that I had with my beer that I was trying to surmount was because it was my yeast.
Okay.
To see what would happen if I used a commercial yeast. So I, shock horror, bought a commercial yeast, and we used it and we made the beer. We didn't put hops in. We did everything else the same as we'd done previously. And both of us felt decidedly ill after drinking the beer.
Really?
Beer that we're making with our own yeast is very low alcohol. I haven't said that before, but it's as well as being, a different flavour, it's very low alcohol. And generally, we'll feel the effects of the alcohol, but we won't feel unwell. And yet this commercial yeast that we used the one time, again, we felt the results of the alcohol. I don't think it was particularly more alcoholic. And yet we were completely knocked out. Rob had a really bad headache, and I was just wiped for the afternoon. And it led us to kind of have a little pet theory, which is that, that was a single yeast culture developed in a lab. I wonder what other things are in our wild yeast culture that mitigate or work in synergy with the yeast culture that's making our beer, and therefore mean that the effects that has on your being are not as negative as the effects of a single yeast culture that has been developed in a lab, which is obviously not something that I can prove, but it's my, subjective experience with it.
Well, who was that gentleman on the Wise Traditions podcast who he has a wine company that you can subscribe, sort of a situation, and get, 6 or 12 bottles or whatever you want delivered every month. And he goes around to all these different wineries and only uses the ones that, like, they get the yeast off the skin by fermenting their grapes, and they grow in like all these vintners are people who say that their primary job is tending the soil because that's where their wine is built and things like that. And he described how, I mean, this is wine, not beer, but I wonder if it translates over, where he said, you don't really have to list all the ingredients on a wine bottle. I don't remember exactly. It was some sort of label law in the 30s, I think. Okay. Maybe it's the same for beer. Do you know?
I don't know if it's the same for beer.
I don't know if I've ever seen the ingredients list on a beer. So
No, they do generally have an ingredients list. The ones that I've looked at have. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he said that a lot of people report, now presumably they do, and that's why they're saying they don't here, but they say that, oh, when I drink your wine, I don't get a headache.
Yeah.
I don't feel like dozy or groggy or whatever you want to say. So I wonder if it's similar, because he alluded to, he said that he said you want to use these factory yeasts, and when you use these all these other ingredients, and it adds all this other negative properties, that it can really affect you in a way that he believes you shouldn't be affected.
Yeah, the world of natural wines is amazing and beautiful, and I hope I will be able to learn more about it as I go on my journey. But
I'll pre-sign up for that course.
It's a similar thing. I just, when I was talking about yeast, that diversity, we don't know what that diversity brings to our bodies from a wild yeast culture and a wild bacteria culture that a single strain that's been grown in a lab doesn't. And, lots of people who don't have the same enthusiasm for ancestral ale as I do look at these ales, and first of all, they'll say they taste really bad, but they just taste different. They don't taste how you would expect a beer to taste because they're not bitter. They don't have the same mouthfeel. They're kind of thicker than normal beer. They might not be as carbonated as beer because they've not been bottled and aged. And also they'll be very disparaging of wild yeast. And, because I'm coming at it from a fermentation point of view and an ancestral point of view, I've got a different set of goggles on, I'm like, well, bring on this wild yeast. This is what we used to do for all of our history, apart from the last 200 years. And, the people who are very set in their ways with airlocks and the way they want beer to taste and using hops, well, fine, that's beer for them. They can get on with that. But I want to play with this. I want to drink this. I want to make this for my family. And I want to delve into and feel like I'm doing something that my ancestors would have done, just like when I'm rendering lard, or when I'm making a sauerkraut. That's what my ancestors would have done. And I have such respect for the power and the beauty of ancestral traditions that I want this beer to be alive in my kitchen. I'm really passionate about it.
Yes. And you should be, because when you consider the power of yeast, this tiny organism, I guess it is an organization, really. But this tiny organism, like you said, Patrick McGovern was unearthing them in archaeological sites. They've outlasted civilizations that collapsed thousands of years ago. And these people spent their life cultivating and tending these little yeast communities. And the yeast communities lived on and are still here.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, I feel like, there's a bit in Sandor Katz's World Fermentation where he talks about, how we've developed with these yeasts. And we've had a symbiotic relationship with yeasts and viruses and bacteria and all that stuff since the beginning of time. And, our ancestors used to know how to work with those and use them in a way that would benefit them, rather than just saying, well, we're in charge here. we're just going to take this one little tiny microbe and then we're going to put it in a packet and dry it and sell it. And then you can have something that tastes the same every single time. That's not life, that feels dead to me, not alive.
That image you just gave me just brought to mind the word, you're colonizing that little tiny specific yeast. So the colonization of yeast, literally, it's extractive, like you say. Oh, we see you, we see your entire universe, and we're going to extract the one piece of you that we want, and we're going to manipulate it and manage it and force it to behave in a way we want it to behave, and plug it in only when we want it plugged in. When yeast really should be this vibrant, exposure over our entire life. And yeast does have a measure of control over us too, because when you have certain yeast active in your body, they can kind of make you do what they want you to do, drive you to eat what they want and things like that. So maybe we should be a little more cautious before we dispense with yeast altogether.
Yeah. So my process, we're recording this, but I don't have an end kind of process at all. I'm in the midst of experimenting with it, along with all the other stuff I'm doing in the kitchen. I'm developing yeast cultures in various different ways. I've been using my Turkish millet drink, boza, to ferment my beer. I've used mead starter to ferment my beer. I've tried to develop my own yeast culture, and I will continue to experiment with the methods that I'm using and the way that I'm creating yeast and the different factors that influence each brew. And I'm sure that we'll be doing another podcast on this in like a year's time to talk about where I'm at. And I feel like there will be an article on my site, which we will link to, which I'm just kind of finishing, where I will write down where I am and what I've done and what I've learned so far. So we'll link that in the show notes. And I'm hoping to be able to document the tradition, the boozer, the Egyptian drink as well, at some point in the future. So
that would be fascinating.
Yeah,
you can buy those strainer straws still. I think Azure carries them, actually. Yeah, you can buy those.
I would love to do that. Now, the strainer straws are like that because, as I said, beer is thicker. And if you're fermenting with the grain in, which is what the boozer does and what the people who were drinking through those straws would have done, the strained liquid isn't completely strained. No, it's not clear and fluid like a beer you would find on your shelf. It's thick. It's got small pieces of the grain in that slip through. And, I spec my filtering equipment. I don't know if it's any more advanced than it would have been 5,000 years ago. I'm just using kitchen equipment. But when you drink it, some of that grain comes up, some of those particles come up. And so those straws had little kind of filters on the bottom of them. So you could probably drink out of the vessel that still had the fermenting grains in, because it would stop those coming up. And there was a big communal. If you look, you'll see pictures of drawings on walls, but also sculptures of people sitting round, big bowls, all with their straw, because it was a communal thing. It was something that people did together. It's not you get this beer and you sit in front of the TV on your sofa on a Friday night. It was part of a communal experience. And
we still have a sort of vestigial memory of that, don't we? Where there's a sort of I don't know, like a semi-taboo against drinking alone, and people, when they get together, in the States anyways, it's very common to have alcohol. Like, I had a wedding with no alcohol and people were shocked. But the alcohol we would be providing, if we did, wouldn't be anything beneficial like this. It would just be literally junk food. So we didn't. But I think we have a little bit of that remnant left in our memory.
Yeah, I think you're right. So that's my beer. That's my what I've got to say about beer. Do you have any more questions, Andrea? Before we wrap?
I guess I would just add that if if somebody wants to see a little bit of an overview of medieval beer, do you remember the Tudor Farm video that you and I had talked
We
about?
can put that in the show notes.
Yeah, Ruth Goodman makes beer kind of it's not detailed enough that you could follow her instructions, but you can sort of see the general overview of what they're talking about in that book you had. And then remember, when somebody tells you that ancestral beer is gross, just look at the other things that they like. Determine, if somebody recommends a book or a restaurant to you, like, find out what they read and what they eat before you take their recommendation.
Yeah, completely. And come to my house and try some, and you'll find that it's not gross. It's really tasty.
Checking for flights
it's beautiful. Now. It makes your food go down better if you have it before. I don't know how that happens. And you'll feel really good after you've drunk it.
You reminded me, I do have a question. Is it considered a digestive tonic? And doesn't Stephen Herod Buhner refer to brewing it with different herbs and things like that?
Yeah, so Stephen Herod Buhner has loads of different brews with medicinal herbs. Okay. I feel like it's a digestive tonic. I can't prove that. I don't know what's in it. I don't have any scientific equipment. I sometimes wonder, because there's not so much alcohol in it, whether it's actually probiotic as well. But again, I don't have any equipment to measure that, so I don't know. But I feel like if I have some of our ale with my dinner goes down with more efficiency than if I don't. So it's a win-win in our house, really. And I'm excited to play with it more. Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about it. You've inspired me, Alison. Okay. Well, to the next episode then. Cheers. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for listening and your lovely questions. Oh, I enjoyed it very much. Until next time. Bye. Bye for now. Thank you so much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation. Come find us on Instagram. Andrea's at Farm and Hearth and Alison's at Ancestral_Kitchen. Until next time, we both wish you much fun, exploration and satisfaction in and out of the kitchen.